I'd like to share with you a message today that's different. It's one of my favorite Christmas messages. Some of you have kind of heard it before. Some of you will be brand new stuff. But what we're going to do is take a virtual tour of the places where the Christmas story took place. And we're going to start in a familiar place, because what I'd like you to do is remember that the place we're in is very real, and the places I'd like to take you today are just as real as where we are today. Of course, it's a lot easier to fly to Israel if you do it with Google Earth than if you actually get on an airplane. And so just enjoy that flight. Our ushers will be passing out peanuts in just a moment as we do that. Oh, sorry, time's up. We got to land. So now we're in the Middle East, and we'll be zooming down to Israel. We're going to chase the story of Christmas, which of course centers around the tiny little town of Bethlehem. It's no tiny town today. It's a very large place. But back then, it was just a little village, and quite a story it tells. The Bible says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea when King Herod reigned. And that's the only part of the passage we're going to look at today. What difference does it make that over Bethlehem there was a king? I hope to unveil that for you a little bit today. Now, if you go into Bethlehem today, you're going to get you're going to go to something called the Church of the Nativity. And that church is very, very old. It is probably one of the oldest buildings in the world that has been in constant use since it was built some 1,700 years ago. It is said to be over the very site where Jesus was born, and it probably is true. But as you go in this church, nothing looks familiar. It doesn't sound like Christmas. It doesn't smell like Christmas. It doesn't look like anything you've ever known in a church if you grew up in the West, as I did, and if you're a Protestant, as I am and as we are, because everything here is pretty much from Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, the practices of the faith. Lots of candles, lots of incense, lots of very old icons. The icons look like paintings at first glance, but if you look, they're made of silver, gold, and precious jewels. People revere the icons, even pray before them and give gifts to them. It's kind of unusual to see there. But this old church is actually built over a cave. And that's very important to remember, because you're not going to see a cave anywhere near anything in this church. But as you get to this particular location, you look down some very steep steps, and there's some people down there. That's where the cave is. But it's been paved, the floor is paved, the walls are ornate. And in this, what looks like a fireplace, is actually a little hole in the middle of an ornate star, and you can reach down and touch the stone where they said Jesus was born. And it probably is true, since the church is so old. Next door is a Catholic church. The reason we go next door is to be able to go downstairs and see the cave in its more natural environment. They've left it more in the natural environment. Pretty much it's just an opportunity to say, see, I told you so. There's a cave under here. Caves in Bethlehem were used by families as second rooms. They were used as places to keep the animals. Shepherds used them out in the fields to hide from the rain. And so it was in a place, a cave, where Jesus was born. And that is your Christmas setting. But this message today is about the King of Bethlehem. Matthew assumed you would know what it meant when he said that Jesus was born while Herod ruled. I mean, if we said something political like we celebrated the Christmas of 2013 when President Obama was in the White House, you would know all kinds of things about that, and you have all kinds of emotions about that. When he says simply that Herod was in control, there were lots of emotions packed in with that. But it's not our backyard. It's not our history. Without a little bit of work, you might not know that Herod had built, for instance, the world's largest palace just outside Bethlehem. And so as you scoot over, if you walked it, you'd probably spend about 3 miles walking, so you could be there in less than an hour. You see this strange-looking hill, and from the heart of Bethlehem, you can see what is left of what has been destroyed, but what has been left of King Herod's palace, called the Herodium. The Herodium was the largest palace in the world of its day. It was a man-made mountain. It was incredibly decorated. We're walking around a swimming pool that's twice as large, or was twice as large, as an Olympic pool. Had a little garden right in the center, a little oasis, a little Garden of Eden there. Herod was quite the gardener, quite the, if people said it couldn't be done, he would build it. And that's why they called him Herod the Great. The tower on top of the mountain, this man-made mountain that had all kinds of storage facilities underneath it and then escape routes underneath it, had room for 1,000 soldiers to live there, along with the royal family, with enough food and water to last for a year if needed. Herod was so paranoid somebody was going to fight him, destroy him, attack him, that he built these incredible, luxurious palaces, but they were fortresses. From that tower, one could see the Mediterranean if enemies were coming from that direction, and you could see across the Dead Sea into Jordan on a clear day to see if enemies were coming from that direction. But that's the Herodium, and that's where Herod lived in the last few years of his life. Was he there when Jesus was born? We don't know. But Josephus said he was buried there, and we know he died right after Jesus was born. A man named Ehud Netzer spent his professional career looking for the remains of Herod's tomb. And today, if you go to the Israel Museum, you'll see an incredible exhibit because just a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, Netzer finally found the remains of the tomb. It was all covered up, not only from time, but from what the people of Bethlehem had done to it. They had not simply broken every part of the edifice of the tomb. They had taken his bones in the year 68 when the revolt started, and they had taken his bones out. They had burned his bones. They had taken the covering of his tomb and ground it into powder. Now, I don't think I've ever been that angry to go over to a cemetery and not only desecrate someone's grave, but to say, I am not satisfied with breaking what is here. I will now ground it into powder. Even with modern machinery, I've never been that angry. But this man not only was cruel enough to kill his own family members, and he had killed his wives, he had killed many of his children, he'd killed strangers, sometimes just on suspicion of wrongdoing. But as you know from the Bible, he had killed the babies of Bethlehem and the surrounding villages. And people never forget that. How cruel was Herod? There was a servant who leaned down and whispered into his ear when it was obvious disease was going to take his life, and said, "It's too bad no one will grieve Herod the Great." Well, unfortunately, Herod rallied. That man lost his life. And Herod sent out the word in the entire country to have arrested leading citizens of every village, of every community. And he would have these citizens arrested because when word would come that he had died, those people would be executed. And then, he said, there will be grief all across Israel because Herod is dead. Thankfully, the son that survived Herod didn't carry out that order. But this is a man, that's how cruel he was. And this was his palace that hung over Bethlehem. And the first chance those people had an opportunity to do so, they destroyed what they could of it, and they especially destroyed any markings of this man's life. How in the world did Herod get to a point where he would build a mountain fortress? I mean, why would he ever even come up with the idea that you could make a house out of a mountain, or even if you needed to, make a mountain? How much money did he have? What kind of attitude says that I want it all, I deserve it all, and if people have to serve me, then that's what will be done? The secret to any life probably could be found in your beginnings. Wherever you grew up, that set the stage for the rest of your life. So if you grew up in suburban America with a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, that's pretty much what you envisioned you would one day have. Maybe a little larger than mom and dad had, maybe a little more yard, whatever it is. But you didn't think about automatically growing up that you would live in a high-rise apartment in New York City. Maybe you wound up there. This is where Herod spent at least some of his growing up years. His father was from Edom. His mother was a Nabatean. And the Nabateans had their capital in Petra, over in Jordan. And if you go there today, you can go through the crack of a canyon and you can see, if you're a fan of Indiana Jones, see the very familiar sights of one of the movies, one of the finishing sights. But this is where Herod learned as a child that this is the standard for our family. You take mountains and you carve homes right out of the mountains. You make a fortress that cannot be defeated, and Petra could not be defeated. The water supply was protected. It was a secret, and it was hidden from, in fact, it was hidden for many centuries, even after it was abandoned. This is where Herod grew up with the idea that it was okay to be on top of the heap of humanity. And he would be at the very top of that little pile. And as he grew up, he built lots and lots of palaces. In fact, if you look at a map of Israel, you can see this paranoid king built his palaces in a way that if trouble came from Idumea down in the south, he could escape to Rome. But if trouble came from Rome, he could escape to Idumea. He had perhaps as many as 12 palaces, ranging from Caesarea and Sebast, capital city of Samaria, over in the Jordan area, and then, of course, down at Masada. In fact, Masada is the most famous of his palaces. The Herodium, the largest, but Masada, oh my goodness, very famous for Israeli national celebrations now, and Masada shall never fall again. Kind of like our Alamo, Masada is their story of incredible fight. But that's history after Herod. This was simply one of his palaces. He had a palace on the north end where it was always cool. He had a palace on the south end. He had swimming pools right next to the Dead Sea, which couldn't be used for drinking water or watering any plants or even for swimming. And so he had water ingeniously taken from the Wadi system, stored up under that mountain, and it was brought up by hand to fill up swimming pools he probably never even swam in. He had enough storage facilities in these storage bins for food that would last for years and years and years. Eventually, Jewish rebels took the place, and they were the last people to be captured by the Romans, and their story is fascinating. Try to remember that all of this was not rock. It was all plastered and painted beautifully. In fact, this has survived over the last 2,000 years. That's the color, if you can imagine all of that room being plastered and painted. There was no expense spared. In a country so poor that there was always a threat of starving to death, this man had an enormous palace here that was absolutely the lap of luxury. And all of it, 5 football fields high, standing up in the air, absolutely protected from any and all enemies. You could live forever at Masada if you could manage to keep the people away, and you could. It was very, very easy. So this is Masada. That's one of his palaces. We'll take a quick swing over across the country to see one more quick palace that's been uncovered. This one to me is maybe one of the most astounding of all. Of course, he had a palace in Jerusalem. He had 3 in Jericho. In Caesarea, the entire city was his crown jewel. He had built it almost from scratch. There was a tiny village here, but Herod made this place 4 times as large as Jerusalem. The city of Caesarea appears several times in the book of Acts, but not in the Gospels, so we're not that familiar with it. The stadium, it was under the dirt, under the sand when I was born. Archaeologists have not only uncovered it and refurbished it, but now concerts are being held there. The Bible says that in the last days, the ancient cities are going to come back to life, and you're looking at one of them that has done exactly that. But Herod's palace, right here, this is part of the swimming pool that jutted out into the Mediterranean. He had fresh water brought in for this pool. Imagine that tile lasting now 2,000 years in that pool. Can you imagine such a mansion today with a pool right out in the ocean? It was just extravagance without match. And the water was brought in from about 17 miles away from the top of Mount Carmel, where Elijah had done battle with the prophets of Baal centuries before. The aqueduct is still there. The images of how great that city was, absolutely stunning. And if you tour Israel today, there's a sense that you're going to tour all that Herod left behind. The great Herod, the king who built everything. He even built the Temple Mount area, expanded it. And he increased by 50% what Solomon had created centuries before. And so archaeologists and historians have called him Herod the Great. But don't ever forget, he was Herod the Hated while he was alive. and he shall always be remembered for cruelty that was just as unmatched as his great buildings. The story of Christmas we're familiar with deals more with a little village called Nazareth. Nazareth today is a large place, some 60,000 or so people packed in to this little city. More Christians in Nazareth than, I guess, any other city in all of Israel. And right in the center of it, a beautiful church called the Church of the Annunciation. And that's where people remember that Mary was given the word, was invited by God to be a part of this incredible plan. A girl who could do a little more than, get married and have babies. And God said, well, that's exactly what I need. I need somebody to carry the child. In Nazareth is a village built by some Arab Christians. It's sort of the ultimate walk through Bethlehem. Only this church understands exactly what I'm talking about. But permanent buildings and the costumes and the way people made a living then. Imagine a place where everybody knew everybody. Because with only 400 or so people around, that's what it would have been like. Every family would have known all the other families. You would have worked together. You would have raised the crops together. You would have been blessed in the years when you had enough, and the years when maybe the rain didn't come or the animals weren't doing so well. You would have suffered together. The Romans had one of their legions of armies down in the valley below, but this little village up on the hill overlooking that incredibly important valley was where Jesus would spend his childhood and early adult years. And if you've ever wanted to know what Mary looked like, she would have been a girl, 14, 15 years old. She was of Middle Eastern descent. She was shy, humble. We know she was humble. And she was used by God in a mighty way. Her story is perhaps the most inspiring of Christmas, that she would sign the contract before she knew what God had written in for the details. She would say yes to the Lord when he asked her to do something, even though this would become the most painful moment of her life. She and Joseph would eventually travel to Bethlehem where the baby would be born. Mary actually made 2 of these trips while she was pregnant. One to see Elizabeth, her cousin, who lived just to the southwest of Jerusalem in that village where John the Baptist was born. And then, of course, right at the last minute, when she and Joseph made that long journey from Nazareth down across the Jordan River Valley. It's the same route they had taken over and over and over again to go to Passover festivals, and they would continue that practice as a young family, taking their children to Passover year after year. Luke tells us that much. They finally would arrive in Jericho after some days of walking, a pretty comfortable walk down the Jordan River Valley. She may have had a donkey. She may not have had a donkey. If the world was traveling because of the tax, then something like a donkey would have been a very fancy car. They were very poor. On top of that, as far as kindness goes, they were the subject of the biggest scandal to hit Nazareth in a long, long time. They did not have a lot of friends. But in Jericho, they would have found a wonderful place to rest. The food there is absolutely incredible. The hospitality is legendary. 7 freshwater springs make the fruit of Jericho some of the best you'll ever find anywhere. And they would have rested because the last leg of their journey was coming up. It's only about 15 or so miles, maybe 16, from Jericho to Bethlehem. But to get there, they were going to have to traverse over something called the Judean wilderness, the first part of it being the Benjamin desert. Hardly a tree in sight, almost no fresh water along the way. You had to carry your own water. The terrain is very difficult. Every step is a bit of a challenge because there's so many loose rocks. It's just some of the most barren territory in all the world. And don't forget, Jericho is at the lowest elevation. Jericho holds the record for being the city built at the lowest elevation anywhere, right next to the Dead Sea, some 1,300 feet below sea level. Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level. Bethlehem is actually a little higher by a handful of feet. And so they were going to have to climb this way. And to walk this journey is something, as we take our travelers to Israel and we try to get out there in the wilderness a little bit, it's just part of the journey you can never forget. You cannot believe how difficult it is. And whether she was on a donkey or walking, all I know is, after this journey, it's little wonder that she was ready to have that baby. She was in full-blown labor and desperate for a place to stay. When they finally finished all this climbing, they made the last little leg to Bethlehem, and they found a village, and this was some of Joseph's extended family. It's been suggested, and I don't know if it's true or not, but you can at least see the plausibility. As word had gotten out about the scandal in Nazareth, it's conceivable one of the reasons they were not welcomed in Bethlehem is that word had preceded them of the conditions of this pregnancy. And they deserved what they got. You can almost hear the people treating them that way. But as they got to Bethlehem, they didn't find a church. They just found a village, and finally they found outside a cave. And if you go a little toward the Herodium today, you can still find shepherds in the fields. Their sheep and their goats, and all around them, these caves formed right out of the ground because of the way the wind and the erosion does. I remember the first time I went in one of these caves, we were kind of just enthralled by the fact that we were there, and then the tour guide reminded us that shepherds use these caves and have used these caves for centuries, not only for themselves to find rest from the sun, but if it's a rain shower, they might rush the sheep and the goats in there and just wait out the rain shower. And it's a place where also the sheep can wait out the hottest part of the day. That tour guide told us, you're used to the smells of Christmas back in the States. The cinnamon that fills your house and the wonderful food that's cooked and these wonderful candles that we have. He said, but if you want to know the truth, the smell of Christmas is right here, and you're standing on about 3 feet of packed sheep dung. That's the Christmas experience. And amazingly, this cave was underneath the shadow of the world's largest palace. And the king over Bethlehem was just a short distance away. Now, this is not the cave where Jesus was born, but it's very much the kind of scenario where it was taking place. And what an incredible comparison for us. A man in a palace who demanded it all, who wanted it all, who got it all, who deserved it all, at least in his mind. And a baby whose earthly parents were so poor and powerless, they had to kind of room with the animals out in the open. There's so much that could be done here, but the contrast could not be greater, right from the very beginning. And the contrast continued. As Jesus grew up, Herod died, but his 3 sons divided the rule over Judea, over Israel. And the one son, also by the name of Herod, who went up to the Galilee region where Jesus was living in Nazareth, he built a new city and a new palace in a place called Zephori. And Zephori is right next to Nazareth. If you're constructing a new city, what kind of workers are you going to need? The historians and archaeologists have wondered a long time if Joseph and his carpenter son maybe did a little work over there in Zephori. And there's also a hint from one of the ladies in Luke's gospel that's mentioned there. Her husband ran the city. Maybe that's where Jesus met her. It's all speculation, but here's the deal. Jesus and Herod were side by side when he was born. Then in Nazareth, he's side by side with one of Herod's sons. When he got tired of Zephori, this son of Herod's moved over to the Sea of Galilee and made a palace in Tiberias. Jesus moved to Capernaum, just around the corner on the lake. And finally, on the day that he died, they were together again. And this Herod, who had for so long wanted to meet Jesus, to be entertained by this miracle worker, finally got Jesus in his presence. And on that particular day, I want you to remember that Jesus carried on conversations with Pilate, a Roman governor who would sentence him to death. He carried on a conversation with a criminal who was hanging on the cross. He carried on conversations with other people throughout the day, but he said not one word to Herod. The lifestyle of the Herodian family is the American lifestyle. And all of this to get to this basic question. I mean, it's just a lot of history. It's a different kind of message, and maybe, I hope it's at least somewhat entertaining and interesting to you. It is to me. It just enthralls me, and it amazes me. We're the first generation to be able to see things like this, especially with this technology. It brings me to question, why do we celebrate Christmas in a way that Herod the Great would love it and Jesus wouldn't recognize it? And the second question is more important. What are we going to do about it? You see, today there's a big blank spot on your sermon outline. There is no, fill in the blank points today. I usually have, 2, 3, 4 points. And don't go out of here and tell everybody I had a pointless sermon. This one's got a big point. You see, I'm all for gifts. I have family members here, and I'm still expecting a gift this Christmas, okay? I want to unwrap that thing and enjoy it and that kind of thing, and I will be bringing gifts myself. We love the tradition of giving gifts at our house. It's so easy to get carried away, though, with the materialism of Christmas, and you know that. Families go into debt buying gifts they can't afford. People worry about the name brand stuff when there are people starving around the world. We get trapped in this concept that's the American dream, really, and I love America. I love the fact that you can be anything and you can accomplish so much. It's incredible. But if we really believe the T-shirt that says, "Dear Santa, I want it all," we have forgotten whose birthday it is. So I just want to challenge you to take this white space and spend the rest of the day. Literally take this with you. Stick it in a Bible, stick it in your pocket or something, and maybe you're eating lunch with friends or with family, and just say, okay, what are we going to do this Christmas that will at least bring Jesus back into the holiday? What are we going to do to guard against getting out of control? What are we going to do to not have that bleak January moment when we get all the bills back and realize that we overspent again? When our girls were at home, they're all three now out of the house, but it was very difficult with all the parties that my wife and I were going to be a part of, and they had their things and they had their friends, and we literally, when we began to think about this idea about bringing Jesus back into the holiday, it got as practical as this. We got out a calendar at lunch one day early in December and said, okay, these days right here, nobody touches. If somebody invites you to a party, you're not going. That includes me, it includes you, because we're going to spend family time together. Now, in those days, we didn't have iPads and smartphones, but if we had, we would have had to have added the rule and no electronics that particular night. Yeah. It's just going to be us, enjoying Christmas together, because that's a way, as fun as it is, that's a way to honor the one who seemed to enjoy spending time and wants to have a lifelong relationship with us, a very personal relationship. And what about a gift for somebody else, somebody that really needs something, food and clothing and the missions effort at Christmas. That's one of the reasons I love our particular denomination, because every Christmas we think about people around the world and we give generous offerings to the Light of Moon Christmas offering. But there are other things we can do. I just want to challenge you to take the rest of the day, children, teenagers, parents, senior adults, and literally write down this is a brainstorming day. What am I going to do to make this Christmas not just the best ever, but Jesus is back in our house, back in this Christmas holiday? You do that this afternoon, the rest of December will be fabulous. If you pass it up, you're going to wind up with some, kind of a Herodian Christmas. The King of Bethlehem, all he left behind were ruins and rocks. If it hadn't been for Jesus, I don't know that any of us would have ever heard his name, because he wasn't that important. Just a tiny little country Israel is. But Jesus, who never owned a palace, never owned any money, didn't have an army, is not the King of Bethlehem. He's the King of Kings, and he still reigns, and his kingdom is more alive than ever, and forever it shall reign.